The village of Anathoth sat in the low hills a short walk north of Jerusalem, close enough to catch the smoke of the temple altar on a still morning and far enough that its priests lived quietly and half forgotten, tending small fields of barley and keeping the old rituals that no one in the capital ever rode out to watch. It was the kind of place a man was born into and buried in without the wider world learning his name. Hilkiah the priest had a son there, a boy named Jeremiah, and by every reasonable expectation that boy's whole life was already written for him. He would learn the sacrifices from his father. He would marry a girl from a house down the road. He would grow old among the almond trees and the goats, and the great affairs of kings and armies would pass over Anathoth the way weather passes over a field, touching everything and remembering nothing. That was the life waiting for him. He was not allowed to keep it. The word came to him in the 13th year of Josiah, king of Judah, and to understand what that year felt like from the inside, you have to understand the king who gave it its number. Josiah had come to the throne as a child of 8, lifted onto it by frightened servants after his own father was murdered in the palace. He grew up a boy king, surrounded by men who had made their peace with the idols his grandfather had set up, the altars on the high places, the carved poles, and the smell of foreign incense drifting through the courts of the house of God. And yet, against all of it, something in Josiah bent the other way. By the 13th year of his reign, he was a young man beginning, slowly and stubbornly, to turn a whole nation back toward the God of its fathers, scraping the rot off the walls of the kingdom one shrine at a time. The wider world was tilting too, though no one in Judah could yet read the signs. The great empire of Assyria, the terror that had swallowed the northern tribes of Israel and dragged them off the map, was rotting from the inside, its grip loosening year by year. Far to the east, along the rivers, a new power was stirring, gathering soldiers and appetite, and it would one day be called Babylon. Judah sat in the narrow space between the empire that was dying and the empire that was being born, and it went on arguing about its harvests and its festivals, blind and busy, the way people always are in the last quiet years before the storm. Into that moment, into that ordinary priest's son in that forgettable village, the voice arrived. And the first thing it said was not a command, but a claim of ownership so total that it reached back past the boy's birth. Before I formed thee in the belly I knew thee, and before thou camest forth out of the womb I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. Sit with the weight of that for a moment. The boy had done nothing. He had earned nothing. He had not volunteered, had not trained, had not so much as raised his hand. He was being told that his purpose was older than his heartbeat, that the shape of his life had been decided while he was still a secret in the dark, and that the purpose was not a small one, not prophet to Anathoth, not even prophet to Judah, prophet to the nations, plural, to kingdoms he had never seen and languages he did not speak. Jeremiah did what almost any honest person would do. He tried to get out of it. "Ah, Lord God," he said, "behold, I cannot speak, for I am a child." It is one of the most human sentences in the whole book, and everything that comes later lives inside it. He was young. He was frightened of his own smallness. He looked at the size of the thing being asked, and he looked at himself, and he could not make the two match. He was not being falsely modest. He was telling the truth as he saw it, and the truth as he saw it was that he was the wrong man. The answer he received did not flatter him, and it did not argue with his fear. It simply went over the top of it. "Say not, I am a child, for thou shalt go to all that I shall send thee, and whatsoever I command thee thou shalt speak. Be not afraid of their faces, for I am with thee to deliver thee." Notice what was promised and what was not. He was not promised that people would listen. He was not promised safety or comfort or that the work would go well. He was promised only two things: that he would not be alone and that he would not be destroyed. Everything else, the hatred, the mockery, the beatings, the pit, the long ache of being right in a country that did not want to hear it, all of that was left unspoken, and all of it was coming. Then came a gesture so intimate, it is easy to rush past. The hand reached out and touched his mouth, and the voice said, "Behold, I have put my words in thy mouth." The very thing Jeremiah had pleaded as his excuse, that he could not speak, was answered by taking hold of the exact organ of his weakness and filling it. The mouth that had confessed itself useless was now the instrument, and with that, the commission was laid on him in full. "See, I have this day set thee over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out and to pull down and to destroy and to throw down, to build and to plant." Count those 6 charges, and count carefully, because the arithmetic is the whole tragedy of his life in a single line. 4 of them are for tearing down. Only 2 are for building up. This was a man handed mostly a wrecking bar, and only a little of the trowel, and he would spend 40 years learning what it costs a tender heart to be sent, again and again, to say the thing that pulls down. To seal the calling, the boy was shown 2 small visions, and they are small on purpose, drawn from the ordinary world outside his own door, so that he could not mistake them for grand dreams. First the voice asked him what he saw, and he answered plainly, "I see a rod of an almond tree." Now, the almond is the first tree in that land to wake from winter, the earliest to break into white blossom, while the other branches are still bare and sleeping. And in the old tongue, the word for almond sounds almost exactly like the word for watching, for staying awake. So when the reply came, it carried a play on that likeness that Jeremiah would have felt in his bones. "Thou hast well seen, for I will hasten my word to perform it." The meaning underneath was gentle and terrible at once. I am awake over my word. I am watching it like a man watches a pot he will not let boil over. What I have said, I will do, and I will not fall asleep before it comes to pass. For a young prophet, about to spend his whole life saying things that would not come true for decades, that was the one comfort he would have to live on. The promise did not depend on him staying awake, because someone else already was. The second vision was warmer to look at and colder to understand. "I see a seething pot," he said, "and the face thereof is toward the north." A cooking pot tilted on the fire, its open mouth leaning south toward the land, ready to spill its scalding contents down over everything below. And the word came, "Out of the north an evil shall break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land." There it was, the shape of the doom, named before Judah had even glimpsed the enemy who would carry it out. The armies that would one day break Jerusalem would not come straight across the desert from the east, where Babylon actually sat. They would sweep up and around and pour down from the north, the way every conqueror came, and Jeremiah was being told to watch that direction his whole life, to keep his eyes on the tilting pot while his neighbors kept theirs on the market and the temple and the reassuring routines of a nation that believed it was safe. And then the reason, spoken without softening. The judgment was not random cruelty. It was coming, touching all their wickedness, who have forsaken me, and have burned incense unto other gods, and worshipped the works of their own hands. A people had taken the God who made them, and set him aside for gods they had carved themselves, and the pot was tilting because of it. Jeremiah's task was to say so out loud in the streets and the temple courts, to faces that would harden and then twist with rage. The calling ended not with a blessing, but with a bracing, the sort of thing you say to a man before you send him into a fight he cannot avoid. "Gird up thy loins," the voice said. "Tighten your robe. Get ready to run and to stand. Say everything I tell you, and leave out nothing to spare yourself." And then the last promise, the one he would clutch in every dark year that followed. "I have made thee this day a defenced city, and an iron pillar, and brazen walls against the whole land. They will fight against you," he was told. "The kings will fight you. The priests will fight you. The people of your own village will fight you. But they shall not prevail against thee, for I am with thee, saith the Lord, to deliver thee." So the boy from Anathoth, who had wanted only to be left alone, and had pleaded that he was too young and too tongue-tied for any of this, stood up as an iron pillar and a walled city, a young man made into a fortress he never asked to be. He did not know yet how long the siege of his own life would last. He did not know that the country he was sent to save would spit him out, that the men of his own hometown would plot against him, that he would weep more than any prophet before him and be believed by almost no one until the walls he warned about were already rubble. He only knew that he had been known before he was born, and that the pot was tilting toward the north, and that the one who put the words in his mouth had promised to stay awake. In that country, water was not a convenience. It was the whole thin line between a living family and a dead one. A spring that ran all year, cold and clear even when the sky had given nothing for months, was the most precious thing a household could own, more than gold, more than land, because gold cannot be drunk, and land turns to dust without it. Below the springs came the cisterns, the poor cousin of running water, a pit hacked out of the rock, plastered over the inside by hand, dug to catch the winter rains and hold them through the long, dry blaze of summer. A good cistern kept a family alive. A cracked one was the cruelest thing in the world, because you did not know it was cracked until you needed it. You dug it, you sealed it, you filled it, you trusted it, and you walked away. And then, in the worst heat of the year, you came back with your bucket and your dying children, and you lowered the rope and it came up empty, the water long since seeped away into the greedy ground, and the pit that was supposed to save you had been quietly betraying you the whole time. That was the picture the young prophet was handed when the voice finally told him what to say to his people, and it is one of the saddest and most exact things ever spoken about the human heart. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns, that can hold no water. Read it slowly, because the whole argument of these years lives inside it. There were two sins, not one, and the second was the stranger of the two. The first sin was leaving the spring that never failed. That is bad enough, an act of pure foolishness, walking away from water that costs nothing and never runs dry. But the second sin was the truly human one. They did not simply go thirsty. They went to enormous effort. They took hammers to solid rock and sweated and bled and dug out pits of their own, difficult, exhausting, expensive pits, and every one of them leaked. A nation had chosen the back-breaking labor of building its own leaking wells over the free gift of a spring that had never once let it down. That is not laziness. That is something far harder to cure. That is pride. And underneath the water, there was a marriage, because that is how God chose to describe the quarrel, not as a legal case, but as a love gone cold. He did not begin with the accusation. He began, astonishingly, with the honeymoon. I remember thee, the kindness of thy youth, the love of thine espousals, when thou wentest after me in the wilderness. Here is the injured party remembering the good years, the early days when the bride had followed him out into a wasteland with nothing but trust, when she had been his and glad to be his. There is a particular ache in an old love recalling how it used to be, and it belongs here to God himself, speaking like a husband who cannot understand what went wrong, turning the question over and over. What did I do? He asks. What iniquity have your fathers found in me, that they are gone far from me? What was the fault in me that sent you looking elsewhere? It is the question every abandoned person asks in the dark, and it is put here into the mouth of the Almighty, which should stop us cold. The heartbreak sharpened into a single image that any bride would feel in her chest. Can a maid forget her ornaments, or a bride her attire? A young woman does not forget her jewelry. She does not misplace the wedding dress. Those things are burned into her memory, treasured, counted, kept. And yet, the voice said, my people have forgotten me days without number. The one thing a bride never forgets, his bride had forgotten, and not for an afternoon, but for years beyond counting. The comparison is almost unbearable in its gentleness. he does not rage first. He grieves first. He is a jilted lover before he is an angry judge, and everything that follows has to be read in that light, or it cannot be understood at all. But grief that is ignored long enough turns, and the indictment did come. He had planted her as a choice vine, wholly a right seed, and she had grown wild and degenerate, a garden turned to weeds. Her guilt was a stain that no washing could lift. Scrub as she might with soap and lye, the mark stayed. And worst of all, she had run after other gods, the way a wild animal runs after a mate it cannot resist, with no shame and no self-control, saying with a shrug, "There is no hope, no. For I have loved strangers, and after them will I go." That last line is the sound of a person who has stopped even pretending, who has decided that returning is impossible, and has made peace with the ruin. It is the voice of someone who has convinced themselves the affair is who they really are now. And here the mercy arrives, and it arrives in a way that broke every rule the ancient world lived by. There was a law that said a man who divorced his wife could never take her back once she had belonged to another. It would pollute the land. By that law, Judah was finished, disqualified, beyond recall. And into the teeth of that law, the voice said the thing that made no legal sense, and all the sense in the world, "Return, thou backsliding Israel, and I will not cause mine anger to fall upon you, for I am merciful. Come back." He had already watched the northern sister of this people carried off into captivity for the very same betrayals, divorced and sent away, and Judah had watched it happen and learned nothing, had in fact played the harlot worse than the sister who was already gone. And still, the word was come back. "Turn, O backsliding children, for I am married unto you." The husband, who had every legal right and every emotional reason to be done, was standing in the doorway with the door wide open, saying the marriage was not over, that he would take her back, that he would give her shepherds after his own heart, that the whole thing could be healed if she would only turn around and walk home to the spring. She would not. And so the tone shifted from the wounded bedroom to the watchtower, because a people that will not be loved back must, in the end, be warned. Before the warning, one last plea, and it is a farmer's plea, plain enough for anyone who ever worked a field. Break up your fallow ground, and sow not among thorns. Fallow ground is a field left so long unplowed that it is gone hard, crusted, packed down, choked with weeds and thorns. You cannot plant good seed in it. First you have to break it, tear it open, do the violent work of the plow before anything soft can grow. Circumcise your hearts, he told them. Cut away the hardness that has grown over them like a rind. It was an invitation to a painful mercy, and it was refused. So the trumpet sounded. Blow ye the trumpet in the land, the alarm that means an army has crossed the border. The lion is come up from his thicket, and the destroyer of the Gentiles is on his way. Evil breaking out of the north, a great destruction, a people cruel and without mercy riding down on horses. And now watch the prophet himself, because this is where he stops being a mouthpiece and becomes a man in agony. He did not deliver the news of his country's coming ruin with cold professional distance. It tore him apart from the inside. My bowels! My bowels! I am pained at my very heart. My heart maketh a noise in me. I cannot hold my peace. He felt the destruction in his gut before it arrived, doubled over with the sound of the trumpet ringing in his skull, sick with grief for the very people who despised him. And when he was given a vision of what was coming, it was the most terrible thing imaginable. He looked at the land, and it had gone back to the beginning, back before the beginning, without form and void, the heavens gone dark, the whole created order unmade, as though God were pulling the thread and letting the world come undone. The undoing of everything, shown to one heartbroken young man who could do nothing but weep and warn. The tragedy was that it did not have to come. God sent Jeremiah through the streets on a strange errand. Find me one honest person. Run ye to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem, and see now, and know, and seek, if ye can find a man, if there be any that executeth judgment, that seeketh the truth, and I will pardon it. One righteous man, and the whole city would be spared. It is the mathematics of a God desperate to forgive, looking for any excuse to hold back the flood. And he could not be found. The people had made their faces harder than rock, and refused to be turned. Their prophets prophesied lies, their priests ruled by those lies. And here is the line that should chill anyone who has ever preferred a comfortable falsehood. My people love to have it so. They did not merely tolerate the deception. They loved it. They wanted the pleasant fiction and paid good money for it. They wanted above all to be told everything was fine, and there were plenty willing to tell them. The false comforters dressed the mortal wound of the nation with a bandage and a smile, crying, "Peace, peace," when there is no peace. And the people, who could no longer feel shame, took the bandage gratefully. They had committed abominations, yet the record says they were not ashamed, neither could they blush. The capacity for a red face, for that involuntary flush that means the conscience is still alive, had died in them. That is a nation in its last stage, not when it sins, but when it has forgotten how to be embarrassed by sin. And so came the last offer, the gentlest and the most refused sentence in the whole book, spoken to people standing at a crossroads with the enemy already on the horizon. Stand ye in the ways, and see, and ask for the old paths. Where is the good way? Walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your souls. Stop, he begged them. Just stop at the fork in the road and ask the old, tested question, where is the good way, the way our fathers found rest in? Only ask and walk it, and your soul will finally be still. It was everything they wanted, offered for free. The rest their exhausted, thirsty, cistern-digging hearts had been chasing all along. And their answer is 3 words long, and it is the epitaph of a generation. We will not walk therein. Not we cannot, not we do not understand, we will not. The spring stood open, the door stood open, the good road lay clear at their feet, and a whole people crossed their arms and said no, and turned back to the leaking pits they had dug with their own bleeding hands. The Temple of Jerusalem was the most beautiful and most reassuring thing the people of Judah had ever built, and on a festival morning it swallowed them by the thousands. They came up the roads from every direction, families in their best cloth, driving animals for sacrifice, the smoke already rising from the great altar. And as they passed through the gates, they felt what a person always feels walking into an enormous stone building raised to God, small, safe, and certain. The walls were thick, the pillars were vast. The place had stood for generations, and would stand forever, and everyone knew it. God lived here. This was his house, his address, the one spot on earth where his name was written, and so long as it stood, they could not be touched. That was the deepest article of faith in the whole nation, and it was into that gate, on exactly such a morning, that a young man from a village up the road was sent to plant his feet and say the one thing no one in the crowd could stand to hear. "Stand in the gate of the Lord's house," the voice had told him, and proclaim there this word, not in a private room, not in a small synagogue on the edge of town. In the gate, in the crush of the crowd, at the exact threshold where their confidence was thickest, and the confidence had a sound. The people, as they entered, were chanting a phrase over and over like a charm, a 3-word slogan repeated 3 times for luck: the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. They said it the way frightened people say anything they have decided to believe instead of examine. It meant, we are fine, God is here, the building is proof, nothing can happen to us. And Jeremiah, standing in their path, was ordered to tell them the words were lies. "Trust ye not in lying words," he cried into the moving crowd. The magic phrase would not save them. The stone would not save them. Only one thing would save them, and it was the very thing they had swapped the stone for. Because here was the swap that infuriated heaven. They had turned the house of God into an alibi. Jeremiah laid it out with a bluntness that must have made the crowd stop dead. "Will you steal," he asked them, "and murder, and commit adultery, and lie under oath, and burn incense to Baal, and chase after gods you have never known, and then walk in through these gates and stand before me in this house that bears my name, and announce that you are delivered, that you are safe, that you are free now to go and do all of these disgusting things again?" He gave the arrangement its true and terrible name. "Is this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Consider what a den of robbers actually is. It is not where the thieves do their stealing. It is the cave they run back to afterward, the hideout, the safe place where they feel untouchable while the loot is still warm in their hands. That is what the temple had become in their minds. Not a place to be changed, but a place to hide from the consequences of refusing to change. They committed the crime out in the world and then sprinted for the sanctuary, and they thought the walls made them immune. Centuries later, a different teacher would stand in that same courtyard and throw this exact sentence back at the money changers, and it would still be true. Then Jeremiah reached for the one memory guaranteed to knock the breath out of them, because they thought a holy building could not fall, and he reminded them that one already had. "Go ye now unto my place which was in Shiloh, where I set my name at the first, and see what I did to it." Shiloh. Almost no one wants to think about Shiloh. Long before there was any temple in Jerusalem, before the great stones, before the golden vessels, the sacred tent and the Ark of the Covenant itself had rested at Shiloh for generations. That was the holy place, the address of God on earth, the untouchable center of the nation, and it was gone, ruined, abandoned, left as a heap for the very same sins these people were committing now. God's argument was as simple as it was devastating. "I have destroyed my own former dwelling before, with my own hand, for exactly this. Do not imagine that a newer, grander building has somehow trapped me inside it. Therefore will I do unto this house, which is called by my name, wherein ye trust, as I have done to Shiloh." The unthinkable had a precedent. They just refused to remember it. And then the voice said the most frightening thing that can be said to a man whose entire calling is to pray for his people. It turned to Jeremiah and told him to stop. "Pray not thou for this people, neither lift up cry nor prayer for them, neither make intercession to me, for I will not hear thee." Sit with the horror of that from Jeremiah's side. He loved these people. He wept for them. His one comfort in the whole miserable work was that he could at least carry them to God, could stand in the gap and beg. And he was told to put the prayers down, that the door of intercession was for now shut, that the disease had gone past the point where pleading could reach it. There is no lonelier order in the book. The man was left holding a grief he was forbidden to do anything with except announce. He was forbidden it because of what was happening in the ordinary homes of Judah, and this is where the sin stops being an abstraction and becomes a scene you could walk into. Look inside one of those houses on an evening. The children are out gathering sticks. The father is crouched at the hearth, kindling the fire. The mother stands at the table with her sleeves pushed up, kneading the dough. It is a picture of a warm, functioning, loving family. Everyone with a job, everyone busy together. And what are they baking? Little cakes for the Queen of Heaven, a foreign goddess of the stars. And they will pour out drink offerings to her and to a whole crowd of other gods. And the children learning to gather the wood are learning that this is what family is. That is the quiet horror of it. Idolatry was not a dark ritual practiced by monsters in a cave. It was a family activity. It was normal. It was the sweetest, most domestic scene imaginable, turned entirely toward nothing. And it was happening in house after house, across the land, while the smoke of the temple sacrifices rose overhead as if everything were fine. And there was a place outside the city where the horror stopped being quiet altogether. In a valley just below Jerusalem, a ravine called the Valley of the Son of Hinnom, at a spot named Topheth, the people had built platforms of fire, and there they burned their own sons and their own daughters alive as offerings. Anchor yourself in the parents who did this, because that is the only way to feel how far a heart can travel from the truth. These were mothers and fathers who had convinced themselves that handing a living child into the flames was an act of devotion, that the gods were pleased by it, that it was piety. They had reasoned their way one small permission at a time, all the way to the fire. And God's response to it broke the pattern of his other complaints, because about this he did not say, "I forbade it." He said something far more chilling. He said it never once entered his mind, which I commanded them not, neither came it into my heart. The thing they told themselves he wanted was a thing so far from his heart it had never even crossed it as a possibility to forbid. For that, the valley was given a new name, and the renaming is one of the grimmest sentences in Scripture. The days were coming, Jeremiah announced, when this place would no longer be called Topheth or the Valley of Hinnom, but the Valley of Slaughter. The valley where they had burned their children to buy safety would become the valley where their own unburied dead would be piled until there was no room left, the bodies lying out as food for every bird of the air and every beast of the field, with no one alive or willing to drive them off. The name itself would become a byword for horror for the rest of history. Long after, people would borrow the name of that little cursed ravine as a word for hell itself. And over the whole land the sentence was the ending of ordinary joy. God would silence the sound of laughter, the voice of the bridegroom, and the voice of the bride, the music of the young, until the country fell as quiet as a grave. The man who had to say all of this was not made of stone, whatever the crowd thought of him. When the sermon was over and he was alone with what he had seen coming, he did not gloat, and he did not harden. He came apart. "Oh, that my head were waters, and mine eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people." He wished his whole skull could turn to water, so that he would never have to stop crying. This is the picture of him that lasted, the weeping prophet, and it is important to understand that his tears were not weakness and not performance. He wept because he could see the wound clearly and knew there was still a cure if only they would take it. "Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there?" he asked. And the ache in the question is that of course there was. There was medicine. There was a healer. The sick simply refused to be treated, and the physician's own messenger stood in the temple gate with the remedy in his outstretched hand and watched the crowd walk past him, chanting the name of the building, certain to the last that the stone would save them. Words had stopped working. The prophet had stood in the gate and preached until his throat was raw, and the crowd had walked past him chanting the name of the building, and so heaven changed its method. If the people would not listen with their ears, they would be made to watch with their eyes. God began to turn Jeremiah himself into the sermon, to hang the message on his body and on the ordinary objects of a household, so that a man who refused to hear a warning might at least be unable to look away from one. It is a strange chapter in the life of any prophet, this business of acting out doom with a belt and a lump of clay, and it cost Jeremiah more than the preaching ever had, because a man can distance himself from his own words, but not from his own hands. The first sign was quiet and personal, and it started with an instruction that made no sense. "Go and buy a linen belt," the voice said. "Put it around your waist and do not let it touch water." So Jeremiah bought a fine new belt, the kind of garment worn against the skin, the innermost band that holds a man's clothing together and cinches everything in place, and he wore it. Then came the second instruction, stranger than the first. "Take the belt off, carry it far away to the great river, and there bury it in a crack in the rock." So he made the long journey to the distant water, dug the belt into a hole in the wet stone, and left it, and went home, and said nothing, and lived his life. After many days the word came a third time, "Go back and dig it up." And Jeremiah made that whole weary journey again, knelt at the same crack in the rock, and pulled out what was left. The belt was ruined, rotted, mildewed, falling apart in his fingers, good for absolutely nothing. And the meaning landed like a hand on the chest. A belt is worn close because it is loved and because it is useful. God had wanted to hold his people to himself exactly that way, wrapped around him, close to the skin, a thing of beauty and glory that everyone could see. Instead, their pride had carried them off to a foreign hole in the ground and left them to rot until they were fit for nothing at all. The tragedy of the belt is that its whole purpose was closeness, and closeness was the one thing they had thrown away. The second sign sent him somewhere ordinary and full of life, the workshop of a potter, and it is worth standing in the doorway of that shop for a moment because the whole scene is soaked in hope. "Go down to the potter's house," the voice said, "and I will let you hear my words there." So Jeremiah went and watched a craftsman at his wheel, the stone spinning under a bare foot, the wet clay rising between two hands, and he watched the man make a vessel that went wrong. Some flaw in the clay, some catch under the fingers, and the shape collapsed, marred, spoiled, and the potter did not throw it out. He simply gathered the ruined clay back into a lump and began again, pressing it into a new shape, whatever seemed good to him to make. Then the word came, "House of Israel, can I not do with you exactly as this potter does with his clay? As the clay sits in the potter's hand, so you sit in mine. And here is the mercy hidden in the picture, the thing that should have brought the whole nation to its knees. As long as the clay is still soft and still turning on the wheel, the potter can start over. A marred vessel is not a lost vessel. There was still time. The invitation was open. Turn back, God said, every one of you, from your evil ways, and I will not do what I have threatened. It was an offer to be remade. And the answer that came back was one of the flattest, most exhausted refusals in the whole book. We will keep walking after our own plans. Every one of us will do whatever his stubborn heart decides. They looked at the potter's patient hands and preferred to stay broken. So the third sign made the point that the second had spared them, and the contrast between the two is the whole hinge of this part of the story. Take a clay bottle, God said, one already fired, already hardened, already finished. Gather the elders of the people and the senior priests, and carry them out to that same cursed valley below the city where the children had been burned. Stand there, at the gate, and pour out the doom in their hearing, all of it, the sword and the siege and the horror coming on a city that had filled this valley with innocent blood. And then, in front of the men who had followed him out, break the bottle, smash it on the ground, and say to them, "This is what I will do to this people and this city. I will shatter it as a man shatters a clay jar, and it can never be made whole again." Feel the difference between the two workshops. The soft clay on the wheel could be gathered up and remade because it was still pliable, still willing. But a jar that has been baked in the kiln is done. It is hard, it is set, it has become exactly what it chose to be, and when it hits the stones it does not squash and reform. It explodes into fragments too small to ever fit back together. That was Judah now. The window in which soft clay could be remade had closed. They had let themselves be fired hard in their own rebellion, and the only thing left to do with a jar like that was to break it in the gate and let everyone hear the sound. Someone heard the sound, and he did not like it. There was a priest named Pashhur, a powerful man, the chief officer of the temple, the kind of official whose whole job was keeping order in the house of God, which in practice meant keeping troublesome prophets quiet. When Pashhur heard Jeremiah announcing that the city would be smashed like a jar, he did what powerful men do to people who will not stop talking. He had Jeremiah beaten. Then he had him clamped into the stocks, a wooden frame that seized the body and bent it into a twisted, aching posture, and he left him there through the night, on public display at the upper gate, so that everyone coming and going could see the great doom-crier folded up and helpless and mocked. It was meant to be the end of him. It was meant to teach him and everyone watching that this is what happens to men who trouble the peace. And when Pashur let him out the next morning, stiff and bruised, Jeremiah did not beg and did not run. He looked at the priest and told him God had changed his name. "You are not Pashur anymore," he said. "From now on your name is terror on every side, because that is what you are going to become, a terror to yourself and to everyone you love. You who have prophesied lies and told this city it was safe, you will watch your friends fall by the sword with your own eyes, and then you will be dragged in chains to Babylon, and you will die there in a foreign land, and be buried there, you and all who believed your comfortable lies." A man in the stocks had just sentenced the man who put him there, and history would prove which of them had the real authority. But the beating did something to Jeremiah that no crowd had managed, and this is where the book stops, being a record of a prophet's messages and becomes the diary of a soul at the end of its rope. Alone after the stocks, Jeremiah turned on God with a bitterness so raw it is almost frightening that it survived into Scripture at all. "You talked me into this," he said. "You overpowered me, and you won, and now I am a laughingstock, mocked from morning to night. Every word I say turns into another reason for people to jeer at me." And then he confessed the thing that kept him trapped. "I told myself I was done," he said. "I decided I would never mention his name again. I would simply shut my mouth and be free of all of it. And I could not. His word became a fire shut up inside my bones, burning, and I wore myself out trying to hold it in, and I could not keep it back. There is the whole prison of his life in a sentence. He could not go on, and he could not quit. The message was killing him, and the silence would have killed him faster. His faith and his despair were both real at once, and they surged against each other in the same breath. One moment he was singing that the Lord stood beside him like a mighty warrior, and his enemies would stumble. The next, he was sinking again. And then he hit the very bottom. And the book lets him lie there without correcting him, which is its own kind of mercy. He cursed the day he was born. Not his enemies, not Pashur, not the nation. The day. He cursed the calendar square he had come into the world on, and he cursed the man who had run to his father with the happy news, "A boy is born to you," wishing that messenger had never carried such joy. "Why?" he asked the empty air. "Why did I ever come out of the womb? Only to see trouble and sorrow and end my days drowning in shame." That is the man God chose. Not a granite pillar who felt nothing, but a person tender enough to curse his own birthday who did the work anyway, who got up from the stocks and kept speaking with the fire still burning in his bones because he had no other way to live. His willingness to break in front of us, and God's willingness to leave the breaking in the record, is the reason his book still reaches people 3,000 years on. He never once pretended it did not hurt. The last good king of Judah died on a plane he had no business riding onto. Josiah the reformer, the boy who had grown into the one ruler in generations who genuinely tried to turn the nation back to God, rode out to the flatlands of Megiddo to block the army of Egypt as it marched north. And there, in a battle that was not his to fight, an Egyptian arrow found him, and the best King Judah would ever have again bled out on foreign grass. The whole country wept, and Jeremiah wept with them, and composed laments for the dead king that were still being sung long after. But the prophet knew something the mourners did not. He knew that the man in the coffin was not the one to cry for. "Weep not so hard for the dead," he told them. "Weep instead for the one who is going away, because the dead king was at rest in his own soil, and what was coming for the living would be worse. From the day Josiah fell, the crown of Judah began to pass from hand to hand, and every hand that touched it made the ruin deeper. 3 of his own blood would wear it in turn, and all 3 would close their ears, and over the wreckage of the whole line a promise of a different kind of king would finally be spoken. The first to take the throne was a young son of Josiah, whom the people themselves raised up, hoping perhaps for a second father. He lasted 3 months. That was all. Pharaoh, who had just killed the father, was not about to tolerate the son, and he reached down and plucked the boy off the throne and dragged him south in chains to Egypt. And this is the one God told the people to truly weep for. He shall not return, the word came. He will never come back to this place. He will die in the country they have carried him off to, and he will never see this land again. Hold that in your mind for a moment, because it is one of the quietest heartbreaks in the book. A young man, king for a single season, spends the rest of his short life in a foreign palace, staring in the direction of home, knowing with total certainty that he will never again see the hills he was born under, that his eyes will close for the last time on a landscape that was never his. He did not die of the sword. He died of exile, of homesickness that had no cure, and the prophet who announced it understood exactly what that kind of dying was. The second king was the one who deserved the least sympathy and got the least. Pharaoh reached into the royal family, pulled out another of Josiah's sons, set him on the throne as a puppet, even changed his name to mark that he now belonged to Egypt, and this man reigned 11 years. He had time. He had every chance to be his father's son. And what did he do with a nation on the edge of the cliff? He built himself a palace. While the poor of his kingdom went hungry and the enemy gathered, this king was busy with cedar paneling and wide upper rooms and walls painted a proud red, and he built the whole grand thing on the backs of laborers he refused to pay. Woe to the man, God said, who builds his house by injustice and makes his neighbor work for nothing. And then came the comparison that should have shamed him into the ground. Your father, God said, ate and drank like any man, but he defended the cause of the poor and the needy, and then it went well with him. Was not that the very meaning of knowing me? To know God, it turns out, was never about the size of your house. It was about whether the weakest person in your kingdom could get justice at your gate. This king knew nothing of that. His eyes and his heart were set on nothing but his own gain and the blood of the innocent. And so his ending was made to match his life. When he died, there would be no mourning, no one crying, "Alas, my brother, alas, my king," no funeral fit for a man at all. He would be given the burial of a donkey, his body dragged out and flung beyond the city gates and left there in the open, in the heat of the day and the frost of the night, unlamented, unburied, an animal's carcass discarded by the road. A man who spent his reign hoarding honor for himself would be denied even the dignity of a grave. The third king was barely more than a boy, and there is a real pathos in him because he inherited a fire his father had lit and had no time to put it out. He came to the throne as the armies of Babylon were already closing on the city, and he too lasted only 3 months before the trap shut. God described what would happen to him with an image of terrible intimacy. "Imagine," he said, "a signet ring on my own right hand." A signet ring was not jewelry. It was a man's very identity pressed into metal, the seal he stamped into soft clay or wax to make a thing official, the emblem of his authority and his person, worn always, taken off never. To hold a king's signet was to hold the king himself. And God said, "Even if this king were the signet ring on my right hand, the closest and most personal thing I own, I would tear him off and throw him away. He would be handed over to the king of Babylon, carried off to that far country, and he would die there." Write this man down as childless, the word said, not because he had no children, but because not one of his descendants would ever again sit on the throne of David and rule in Judah. The royal line of the great King David, the line that was supposed to be eternal, was being written off in a single sentence, plucked like a ring and thrown into a foreign dark. And then God stepped back from the individual kings and named the whole disaster in one word: shepherds. The kings of Judah had been given the flock of God to tend, and a shepherd exists for one reason: to feed the sheep and to keep them safe, to lead them to water and to stand between them and the wolves. These men had done the opposite of everything a shepherd is for. "Woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture," God said. You have scattered my flock. You have driven them away. You have not cared for them at all. They had fed themselves fat on the flock, and left the sheep to be torn to pieces, and driven off into the hills, and the whole tragedy of Judah could be read in that single failure of leadership. The people were scattered because the men who were supposed to gather them had been too busy building palaces and grasping crowns to notice they were losing every last sheep. But heaven does not end on the note of the scattered flock, and here, over the ruin of 4 failed kings and a broken royal line, the most beautiful promise in the book quietly opens, like a green shoot out of a dead stump. The days are coming, God said, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch. Not another rotten limb of the same diseased tree, but a living branch, a king who will actually reign, who will actually prosper, who will do the one thing every one of these men refused to do: execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days, the people will finally be saved. They will finally dwell in safety. He will be the shepherd the others never were, the king who gathers instead of scatters, who protects instead of devours. And he was given a name to carry, a name that was really a promise folded up small: the Lord our righteousness. After a parade of kings whose own righteousness was a hollow joke, whose justice was for sale and whose glory was painted on with vermilion, a king was coming whose very name declared that the righteousness his people would live by was not their own, and not his making, but God's own righteousness given to them as a gift. Jeremiah did not know how far off that king stood. He only knew that the throne he watched crumble was not the last word, that a branch would grow where the tree had fallen, and that the shepherd Judah had never had was still somewhere in the long dark ahead, on his way. Somebody set 2 baskets of figs on the pavement in front of the temple, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Figs came in from the groves by the basket load in season, and any farmer's child could sort them at a glance. In the first basket, the figs were beautiful, the early ripe kind that come first off the branch, soft and sweet and perfect, the sort you eat standing up before they ever reach the market. In the second basket, the figs were disgusting, rotted through, sour and slimy and swarming, so far gone that no one would put one in his mouth. Good figs and bad figs, sitting side by side in the sun. And God stood the prophet in front of them and asked him what he saw. And when Jeremiah said the plain and obvious thing, that some were very good and some were very bad, God turned the whole basket of the nation's assumptions upside down and shook it out onto the ground. To understand the shock of it, you have to know what everyone in Jerusalem already believed. Babylon had come once already and taken the cream of the city away in chains: the young king, the princes, the skilled craftsmen and the metal workers, the best of everyone, marched off hundreds of miles to sit by foreign rivers in a land of strange gods. And the people left behind in Jerusalem had drawn the obvious conclusion: those poor souls dragged to Babylon were the cursed ones, clearly, the ones God had spat out, the ones who had lost everything, home and temple and country all at once. And we who remain, they told themselves, we in the city with the walls still standing and the altar still smoking, we are the blessed, the spared, the ones God kept. It was the natural math of it. The one who keeps his house is favored. The one who loses everything is condemned. Everyone knew that. And God said no. The good figs, the sweet and perfect ones, the ones I have set my eyes on for good, are the exiles. It is the ones I sent away to Babylon whom I will watch over, whom I will bring home again, whom I will build up and plant and never again uproot. It is those homesick captives, sitting by the rivers of a hostile empire, certain that heaven had thrown them in the rubbish, to whom God said the tenderest words in the chapter: I will give them a heart to know me, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God, and they shall come back to me with their whole heart. The ones who looked cursed were carrying the future inside them. And the rotten figs, the ones too spoiled to eat, were the ones who stayed. The king in his palace and the crowd in the streets congratulating themselves on being spared. They were the discarded ones. They would be scattered to the ends of the earth, a horror and a byword and a curse wherever they were driven, chased by sword and famine and plague until there was nothing left. The whole tidy human theory of blessing and curse had been precisely backward. The blessing was not in the comfortable place. It was hidden inside the disaster, growing quietly in the very people everyone had written off. It is one of the deepest and most disorienting truths in the entire book, and it should make anyone pause who has ever looked at a suffering person and assumed God had turned his face away. Then God put a different object in the prophet's hand, and this one was not for sorting, it was for pouring. "Take this cup," he said, "the cup of my fury, filled to the brim with a wine that does not cheer but destroys, and carry it to every nation I send you to, and make them drink." And Jeremiah, in the vision, took the cup and went from throne to throne, pressing it to the lips of kings, and the effect of the wine was terrible. Those who drank it staggered like drunks in the street, reeled and raved and lost their minds, because what was really being poured into them was the sword. And notice, of all the mercies and horrors in the order of it, who was made to drink first? Not Egypt, not Babylon. Jerusalem and the cities of Judah drank first, before anyone else on earth. Judgment did not begin with the pagans out at the edges. It began at the house of God, with God's own people, because those who had been given the most light were answerable for the most darkness. And from Judah the cup went around the whole known world, to Egypt and the desert tribes, to the Philistine cities on the coast, to Edom and Moab and Ammon, to Tyre and Sidon, to the far kings of the north, one after another forced to lift it and swallow, staggering and vomiting and falling and never rising again. And last of all, at the very bottom of the round, when every other nation had drained its portion, the cup came to Babylon. The empire that had been the very instrument of the wine, the hand that poured it out on everyone else, had to drink it too, all the way to the dregs. No one was exempt. Not the chosen who had failed, not the pagans who had never known, not even the great destroyer who thought itself the one holding the cup rather than the one drinking it. God would roar over all of it, the record says, like a man shouting as he tramples grapes in the winepress, and the sound of his controversy with the nations would carry to the ends of the earth. And over the whole scene, over the exiles carrying the future and the nations reeling from the cup, God hung a number, and the number is the most merciful and most merciless thing in the section at the same time. 70 years. This land will lie desolate, he said, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. Sit with that figure for a moment, and do the arithmetic that every exile must have done in the dark. 70 years is not a season. It is not a hard winter you endure and then forget. 70 years is a human lifetime, and then some. It meant that nearly every grown man and woman marched off to Babylon would live out the rest of their days there and die there, buried in foreign ground, and never once see the hills of home again. The old would not come back. Their children mostly would not come back. It would be the grandchildren, people not yet born, who would finally walk the road to Jerusalem. That is the merciless edge of the number. It was long enough to bury a generation. And yet the very same number was the one thread of pure mercy running through the whole prophecy, because it had an end. It was 70 years, not 70 times 70, not forever. God did not say this land will lie desolate and leave the sentence hanging open with no horizon, which is the thing that truly breaks a captive, the endlessness of it. He fixed a term. He set a clock ticking, and a clock that ticks is a clock that will one day stop. When the 70 years were accomplished, he said, "I will turn and punish the king of Babylon and that whole nation, and I will bring my people home." Even the man who was about to grind Judah into the dust, the great Nebuchadnezzar himself, God called by a name that must have stunned everyone who heard it, "my servant." The pagan emperor was nothing more than a tool in a hand, doing a job assigned to him, and when the job was finished, the tool would be set down and broken in its turn. So the darkness that was coming had a shape after all. It was not a bottomless pit. It was a room with a door on the far side, and the door had a time written over it. 70 years. Long enough to feel like the end of everything. Short enough, in the accounting of God, to be only a night before a morning. And Jeremiah, who had watched the good figs carried off looking for all the world like the cursed ones, understood that the ticking of that clock was, for anyone with the eyes to hear it, the sound of hope keeping its appointment in the dark. Picture a grown man walking through the streets of the capital with an ox yoke strapped to his shoulders, not carrying it, wearing it. A heavy wooden crossbar, of the kind you lay across the necks of a pair of oxen to plow a field, fitted onto his own neck with leather straps, so that he stooped a little under the weight of it, and it creaked when he turned his head, and he wore it through the markets and past the palace and into the temple courts where the important men gathered. People stared. Children pointed. Soldiers muttered the word traitor. And the man in the yoke, the prophet Jeremiah, went on walking as if the collar of a farm animal were the most natural thing in the world for a servant of God to have around his throat, because to him it was the plainest sermon he had ever preached. But to understand how a man ends up parading his own city dressed like a plow beast, you have to go back to the morning they very nearly killed him, because everything he did afterward, he did knowing exactly what it might cost. It had happened after the sermon in the temple gate. Jeremiah had been ordered to stand in the court and say every word without softening one of them. And when he finished telling the crowd that God would leave this house a ruin, the way he had once left the old sanctuary at Shiloh, a ruin the crowd turned into a mob. The priests and the temple prophets seized him, and the cry went up, "You shall die! A man who threatens the temple threatens everything," and they wanted him dead on the spot. Word reached the palace, and the officials of Judah came up and took their seats in the gateway to hold a formal trial, and the charge was capital. This man has prophesied against the city. He deserves to die. And here is where you see what Jeremiah was actually made of, because he did not beg and he did not flatter. He told them the truth one more time. "God sent me to say every word you heard," he said. "So change your ways, and God may yet relent. As for me, I am standing in your hands. Do with me whatever you think is right. But be very sure of one thing. If you put me to death, you are killing an innocent man, and his blood will be on you and on this city and on everyone living in it." It was not a defense so much as a warning wrapped around a shrug, and it worked. The officials and the crowd turned to the priests and said, "This man does not deserve to die. He spoke to us in the name of the Lord." And then some of the old men of the land stood up and remembered their history. How long ago a prophet named Micah had said Jerusalem would be plowed like a field, and the good king of that day had not killed him, but had listened and feared God, and disaster had been turned aside. Precedent saved his life that day. But there was another prophet, and he did not walk out of his trial alive, and Jeremiah never forgot him. His name was Uriah, and he had done exactly what Jeremiah did, preached against the city in the name of the same God with the same courage. And when the king heard it, the king wanted him dead. Now here is the human thing, the thing that makes Uriah so easy to understand and so hard to judge. He got scared. He heard that the soldiers were coming for him, and he did the thing almost any of us would do. He ran. He fled across the border all the way to Egypt, out of reach, safe, and it did not save him. The king sent men after him into Egypt, and they found him. And they dragged him back over the border in custody to the man who wanted him dead. And the king killed him with the sword, and had his body thrown into the pit where the poorest and most nameless people were buried, denied even a decent grave. Remember Uriah whenever you are tempted to think Jeremiah's survival meant the danger was not real. It was real. A faithful man, saying the very same things, was hunted down across a kingdom and executed and dumped in a common grave. And the only reason Jeremiah was not lying beside him was that one powerful official, a man named Ahikam, put his own hand over him, and shielded him from the crowd. Jeremiah lived on borrowed protection, and he knew it, and he put the yoke on anyway. The yoke was for the kings. A cluster of small nations around Judah were whispering together about rebellion, plotting to throw off the growing weight of Babylon, and their ambassadors were in Jerusalem stirring the pot. So God had Jeremiah make the yoke and wear it and send word to all of them, and the message was as unwelcome as a message can be. God has handed the whole earth for now to the king of Babylon, he told them. Put your neck under his yoke and serve him, and you will live and stay in your own land. Refuse, and you will be destroyed by sword and famine and plague. Do not listen to your prophets and fortune-tellers who promise you that you will not have to serve Babylon. They are lying to you, and their lies will get you killed. And to his own king he said the same with tears in it. Bring your neck under the yoke and live. Why should you and your people die when you could simply bow and survive? Understand how this sounded. Jeremiah was standing in a proud and frightened nation, telling everyone to surrender, to collaborate, to bend the knee to the pagan empire on the horizon. To every patriot in the city, it was treason of the worst kind. A prophet of God preaching defeat, undermining the war effort, breaking morale. It looked like cowardice, and it looked like betrayal. And it was neither. It was the single most loving thing anyone in Jerusalem was saying, because it was true, and the truth was the only thing that could keep them alive. Surrender was survival. Resistance was the grave. The man in the ox collar was the only one telling them how to live. Then a rival stepped forward to tell them what they wanted to hear, and his name was Hananiah, and he was everything Jeremiah was not. Confident, popular, patriotic, and completely wrong. In the temple, in front of the priests and the whole crowd, Hananiah announced the opposite of the yoke. God has told me, he cried, that within 2 full years he will break the power of Babylon, bring back every treasure they stole from the temple, and bring home the exiled king and every last captive. 2 years and it will all be over. 2 years and everyone comes home. It was a beautiful thing to say, and the crowd surely loved him for it. And Jeremiah's response is one of the most gracious moments in the whole book, because he did not sneer. He said, Amen. Amen. May the Lord do exactly that. May he bring it all home just as you say. Jeremiah wished with his whole broken heart that the cheerful man were right. But then he added the quiet test that separates the true from the false. The prophets before us spoke of war and disaster, and when a prophet promises peace, we will only know he was truly sent when his peaceful words actually come to pass. Prove it by what happens. And Hananiah, in front of everyone, reached over and took the wooden yoke off Jeremiah's neck and broke it in 2, and declared that this is how God would break Babylon's grip within 2 years. And Jeremiah, remarkably, said nothing. He simply walked away, carrying the broken pieces, letting the crowd cheer the man who told them the sweet lie. The answer came later, in private, and then it came for Hananiah in public. God told Jeremiah to go back and say this, You have broken a yoke of wood, but you have only made yourself a yoke of iron. The rule of Babylon that Jeremiah preached had not been loosened by snapping a piece of timber. It had been made heavier and harder and utterly unbreakable, an iron collar now instead of a wooden one. And to Hananiah himself the word was terrible and exact. The Lord did not send you. You have made this whole people trust in a lie, and so this very year you are going to die, because you have preached rebellion against God. Count the awful arithmetic of it. Hananiah had promised the nation 2 full years of freedom. He was given 2 months of life. In the 7th month of that same year, the man who told everyone the comfortable falsehood was dead, and the man in the yoke was still standing. And everyone who had cheered the lie now had to live with which of the 2 prophets the grave had proven true. And then Jeremiah did something that must have felt to the exiles who received it. like a betrayal of everything they were hoping for. He wrote them a letter. Far away in Babylon, the captives were doing what captives do, living out of their bags, refusing to unpack, listening to the prophets among them, who promised that this whole nightmare would be over any day now, and they would all be marching home by next spring. And into that fragile, homesick hope, Jeremiah sent a letter that told them to stop waiting. "Build houses," he wrote, "and settle down in them, plant gardens, and eat what grows. Marry, have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and husbands for your daughters. Have grandchildren, multiply, do not dwindle. Make a life there." And then the hardest sentence of all. "Seek the peace and welfare of the city I have carried you into, and pray to the Lord for it, because if that city prospers, you will prosper with it. Pray for Babylon. Pray for the welfare of the enemy that burned your world down." It was the last thing any of them wanted to hear, because it meant this was not a short storm to be waited out. It was going to be the rest of their lives, and the lives of their children, the same 70 years he had named before, a whole span measured out and unavoidable. The city was dying by inches, and the prophet was in prison. Outside the walls of Jerusalem, the army of Babylon had built its earthworks and dug in for the long kill, the siege ramps rising a little higher every day. And inside the walls, the food was running out, and the people were beginning to starve. This was the end that Jeremiah had spent his whole life warning about, arriving at last exactly as he had said it would, and his reward for being right was a cell. His own king had locked him in the courtyard of the guard for the crime of telling the truth, for saying out loud that the city would fall and the king would be handed to Babylon. So there he sat, a prisoner in a starving city at the blackest hour of its history, everything he had feared coming true on the other side of the wall. And it was precisely there, in that exact spot, at that exact hour, that God handed him a pen and told him to write a book, and the book was nothing but light. It is one of the strangest and most beautiful facts in all of Scripture that the brightest promises Jeremiah ever received were given to him in the darkest room he was ever kept in. When there was nothing left to lose, heaven finally opened its hands and showed him everything it had been saving. "Write all these words down in a book," God said, "because the days are coming when I will bring my people home." And then the promises came pouring out, one after another, and they did not deny how bad things were. They went straight through the badness and out the other side. "Yes, this is a day of terror," God said, "a time of trouble like nothing that has come before. But my people will be saved out of it, not spared it, saved through it. I will discipline you, but I will not destroy you. I will make a full end of the nations I scattered you among, but I will never make a full end of you." And then he reached for the wound itself, the wound everyone said could not be healed. "Your hurt is beyond curing, the world tells you," God said. "Your injury is fatal. No one even bothers to plead your case anymore. They call you the outcast, the city nobody wants." And to that verdict of the doctors, God said the impossible thing. "I will restore your health and heal your wounds, I myself, the one who struck you." The very hand that had let the blow fall was the hand that would bind the wound, and no injury is beyond curing when that is the hand doing the healing. Then the promise of return arrived, and it arrived not as dry policy, but as music and dancing. "I will build you again," God said to the shattered nation, "and you will be rebuilt. You will pick up your tambourines again and go out in the dances of the joyful. The old will dance beside the young, and I will turn your mourning into joy and give you gladness for your sorrow. I have loved you," he said, "with an everlasting love, and that is why I keep drawing you back to me with kindness, even when you run." And into that promise of dancing came the most human sound in the whole book, the sound of a mother crying. There was a place on the road where the columns of chained exiles were gathered before the long march east, and God heard, rising from that place, a voice of weeping and bitter mourning. It was Rachel, the ancient mother of the nation, weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because her children were gone, marched off over the horizon and not coming back. Anyone who has stood at a window and watched someone they love be taken away knows that cry. The cry that will not be soothed, because soothing feels like a betrayal of the grief. And to that inconsolable mother God spoke the tenderest words a grieving parent can hear. "Stop weeping," he said. "Dry your eyes. Your work of sorrow will be rewarded. Your children will come back from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future, and your sons and daughters will come home again to their own country." He did not scold the weeping. He answered it with the one thing that could actually reach it, a promise that the ones who were gone were not gone forever. And then, at the very center of the book of comfort, came the promise that everything else in the Bible would eventually be built upon, and it went deeper than dancing and deeper than the return, because it went inside the human heart itself. "The days are coming," God said, "when I will make a new covenant with my people, and it will not be like the old one." The old agreement had been written on tablets of stone, carried down a mountain, laid before the people, holy and true and good, and they had broken it again and again, the way a bride breaks a vow, until the stone tablets were nothing but a record of their failure. "So this time," God said, "I will do it differently. I will not write my law on stone and set it in front of you where you can walk away from it. I will put it inside you. I will write it on your hearts, in your inmost being, so that it is no longer an external rule you keep failing to keep, but a living thing woven into who you are." And there was more. "No longer," God said, "will people have to teach each other to know me, the priest instructing the peasant, the learned lecturing the simple, because they will all know me directly, from the smallest child to the oldest elder, every one of them with their own unmediated hold on God. And under all of it, holding the whole new covenant up like a foundation stone, came the sentence that is perhaps the most relieving in all of Scripture. I will forgive their wickedness," God said, "and I will remember their sins no more. Not overlook, not file away for later. Remember no more." The God who forgets nothing chose to forget the one thing his people could never forget about themselves, and that deliberate, merciful amnesia is the ground that everything else stands on. He backed the promise with the sun and the moon and the stars. Only if those fixed lights could be torn out of the sky, he said, would his people ever cease to be a nation before him, as sure as sunrise. That's sure. And then Jeremiah was asked to prove that he believed all of it, not with a sermon, but with his savings. While the siege was still tightening, and the enemy was already occupying the countryside, his cousin walked into the prison courtyard with an offer. There was a field back home in Anathoth, family land, and by the old custom of keeping property within the bloodline, Jeremiah had the right and the duty to buy it. It was, on every rational level, the worst investment in the history of the world. The village was in a war zone. The land was already, or about to be, under the boots of the Babylonian army. Jeremiah was a prisoner who would very likely never walk free, let alone stroll out to inspect a field in enemy-held territory. Every sane person would have laughed the offer out of the room, and Jeremiah bought it. He weighed out the silver, 17 shekels of it, good money for worthless ground, and he did the whole thing properly, signed the deed, sealed it, called in witnesses, made it as legally airtight as any purchase in peacetime. Then he handed the sealed deed and its open copy to his scribe Baruch, and gave an instruction that was the whole point of the exercise. Put these documents in a clay jar, so they will keep for a long, long time. Why go to all that trouble over a field he would never see? Because God had told him to say this: houses and fields and vineyards will be bought again in this land. Jeremiah was placing a bet in silver in front of witnesses that the exile would end and the people would come home, and life would become so normal again that someone would want a clean title to this very field. He was so certain of the future that he put money on it while his present was collapsing around his ears. And yet, in one of the most honest moments in the book, even Jeremiah did not fully understand what he had just done. He prayed, and his prayer began in confidence and ended in a question. "Nothing is too hard for you," he said. "You made heaven and earth. You show mercy to thousands, great and mighty God." And then, having said all that, he laid his confusion on the table. "The siege ramps are against the walls. The city is being handed over to the enemy right now. And yet you told me to buy a field and count out the silver and seal the deed." He obeyed before he understood. And then he told God he did not understand, which is exactly what faith looks like when it is real and not pretended. And God answered him with a question of his own, a question that gathered up the whole book of comfort into a single line. "Behold, I am the God of all living things," he said. "Is anything too hard for me? Yes, the city will fall, and it will burn because of everything they have done. But I will gather my people out of every country I have driven them to, and I will bring them back to this very place, and I will make them live in safety, and they will be my people, and I will be their God. And I will make an everlasting covenant with them, and put such reverence in their hearts that they will never turn away again. And fields," God said, "fields exactly like the one you just bought, will be purchased again in this land that you all call desolate. Men will hand over silver and sign deeds and seal them and call in witnesses, just as you have done today." The prophet's absurd, defiant, hope-soaked purchase was not a mistake. It was a prophecy with a receipt attached, a deed sealed in a jar to outlast the fire, waiting in the dark for the day the exiles would come home and someone would break the clay and read that even at the end of the world, one man had believed there would be a morning. It was winter, and the king was warm. In the 9th month of the year, in the heated inner rooms of the palace where the royal household waited out the cold, King Jehoiakim sat in front of a brazier of burning coals, while a servant read aloud to him from a scroll. The scroll was the word of God, 20 years and more of it, everything Jeremiah had said since the days of the old king, written out by hand and carried here to be heard. And as the reader worked his way down the columns, the king did something so deliberate and so cold that it has never lost its power to chill. He took a scribe's small knife, and each time 3 or 4 columns had been read, he sliced them off the scroll, and he dropped them into the fire, and he watched them burn, and then he listened to a few more columns and cut those off and burned them too. Column by column, patient as a man trimming his nails, he fed the entire word of God into the coals until there was nothing left but ash on the hearth. He was not raging. That is the terrible part. There was no storm of anger, no wild gesture. There was only a bored, contemptuous calm. A man so unimpressed by the God who made him that he disposed of his warnings the way you might feed scrap paper to a fire on a cold night. His officials begged him to stop. Some of them trembled. He did not so much as tear his robe. He simply kept cutting and kept burning, certain that a problem could be solved by destroying the paper it was written on. The scroll had been made in hope. God had told Jeremiah to gather everything he had preached across all those years and write it down in one place, dictating it to his faithful scribe Baruch, and the reason was mercy. Perhaps if the whole nation heard the full weight of it read out at once, all the warnings stacked one on top of another, they would finally be frightened enough to turn, and God could forgive them. Jeremiah himself was banned from the temple, so he sent Baruch to read it aloud on a public fast day when the courts were full. The officials who heard it went pale and said the king must be told, and, decent enough to fear for the 2 men, they warned Baruch to take Jeremiah and hide. They were right to. When the king finished burning the scroll, he gave the order to arrest both of them, and the record says simply that the Lord hid them. And then came the answer to the fire, and it is one of the quietest, most unanswerable rebukes in all of Scripture. God told Jeremiah to get another scroll and write the whole thing over again, every word the king had burned. So Baruch took up his pen a second time, and Jeremiah dictated it all again, and when they were done, the record adds one devastating detail. There were added to them many more words besides. The burned scroll came back longer. You can put the word of God in the fire, and all you accomplish is to make it return with more to say. A king with a knife against the God who spoke the world into being was never a fair fight, and Jehoiakim, who thought he had won a winter evening, had only proven he could not so much as singe the thing he despised. And to show the nation how far it had fallen, God set a small and obscure family in front of it like a mirror. There was a clan called the Rechabites, wanderers who lived by an old family rule handed down from a long-dead ancestor named Jonadab, who had told his descendants to drink no wine, ever, to build no houses, plant no fields, own no land, but to live in tents like nomads and stay free of all of it. And they had done it. For generations, right down to the present day, they had kept that command, not because it was easy and not because anyone was watching, but simply because their father had said so. God told Jeremiah to bring them into the temple, into a side room, and set pitchers of wine and cups in front of them and say, "Drink." And they refused, politely and completely. "We do not drink wine," they said. "Our father Jonadab forbade it to us and to our children forever, and we have kept his word." That was the whole lesson, and it landed like a slap. Here was a family that had obeyed a mere human ancestor, in something as small and harmless as abstaining from wine, faithfully, for hundreds of years without a single lapse. And here was the nation of God, to whom the living God himself had spoken over and over, rising early to plead with them, and they would not obey him in anything at all. The sons of Jonadab kept a dead man's word about a cup of wine. The children of God could not keep their father's word about their own lives. And so the same breath that pronounced doom on faithless Judah pronounced a blessing on the faithful Rechabites, that their line would never lack a man to stand before God. The obscure and the overlooked, quietly loyal in a small thing, were held up to shame the great and the chosen who were disloyal in everything. Years later, under a different and weaker king, the nation found a new way to break faith, and this one had human misery baked right into it. The armies of Babylon were at the walls, and in the terror of the siege, King Zedekiah and the people did something genuinely good. They made a solemn covenant before God, in the temple itself, to set free every Hebrew slave, to let their own countrymen out of bondage as the old law of God required. And they did it. For a moment in the shadow of death, the whole city obeyed, and men and women who had been owned walked out into freedom, and then the siege briefly lifted. The Babylonian army pulled back to deal with a threat from Egypt, and the pressure came off the city, and the people looked at their newly freed slaves and their newly empty fields and made a cold calculation. The crisis seemed to be passing. They did not need God anymore. So they hunted down the very people they had just liberated and forced them back into chains, dragged them out of their one taste of freedom and back into bondage. Think of what that did to those men and women, to be given liberty in the morning and have it torn away by the same hand in the afternoon, freed by a covenant sworn before God and re-enslaved the moment their masters felt safe. And God's answer came with a terrible, exact irony. "You would not proclaim liberty to your brothers," he said, "so I now proclaim a liberty for you, a liberty to the sword, to famine, and to plague." When they had sworn the covenant, they had done it the old way, cutting a calf in two and walking between the bloody halves, a ritual that meant, "May I be butchered like this animal if I break my word." They had broken their word. And God told them they would become exactly what they had walked between, their bodies given to their enemies and left as carrion, torn like the calf they had cut in half to seal a promise they never meant to keep. And the man who kept telling them all of this paid for it by sinking into the mud. Jeremiah went on saying the one thing that could save any of them, that whoever stayed in the city would die, but whoever surrendered to Babylon would live. And to the officials of Zedekiah's court, this was treason, plain and simple, a prophet sabotaging the war by draining the courage out of the soldiers. So they came to the king and demanded his death. And this is where the weakness of Zedekiah becomes almost unbearable to watch. The king did not defend the prophet and did not condemn him. He simply shrugged and handed him over, saying he was in their hands, and that the king could do nothing against them, a ruler so hollow he could not save an innocent man he personally believed. So they took Jeremiah and lowered him on ropes down into a cistern in the prison yard, a deep pit dug to hold water, and there was no water in it, only a thick bed of mud at the bottom. And the prophet went down into the ropes and sank into the mire and stuck there. They meant for him to die slowly in the dark and the cold and the muck, starving at the bottom of an empty well while the city fell apart above him. It should have been the end of him. And it was a foreigner who saved him. In the palace, there was a man named Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian, an outsider twice over, a servant from a distant land, the last person anyone would have expected to have the courage the whole native aristocracy lacked. He heard what had been done to Jeremiah, and he did not shrug the way the king had shrugged. He went straight to Zedekiah, who was sitting in one of the city gates, and he said plainly that these men had done a wicked thing, that the prophet would starve to death in the pit. And the king, who could be moved by anyone with a stronger will than his own, told him to take 30 men and pull Jeremiah out before he died. Then Ebed-Melech did something so gentle it stops the whole grim story for a moment. He gathered up old rags and worn-out clothes from somewhere in the palace stores, and he let them down into the pit on the ropes, and he called to Jeremiah to put the soft rags under his arms, between his flesh and the ropes, so that when they hauled him up, the cords would not cut into him. A man being rescued from a death pit, and his rescuer thought to pad the ropes so it would not hurt. They pulled him up out of the mud and back into the light, and the one person in the entire dying city with both the courage and the kindness to do it was a foreigner from far away, while the king dithered and the nobleman plotted, and the prophet's own people left him to sink. God did not forget it. He sent word to Ebed-Melech that when the city fell he would be spared, because he had put his trust in God. In a book full of the failure of the important, the mud pit is where the least important man in Jerusalem became the greatest, and where the word of God about who is truly faithful was written one more time, in rags and rope at the bottom of a well. For 1.5 years, the army of Babylon sat in a ring around Jerusalem and waited, and inside the walls the city slowly starved to death. The siege went on through one winter and into the heat of the next summer, and the famine grew so terrible that the suffering behind those walls became a thing too dreadful to describe. And then, in the 4th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, on a day the survivors would never be able to forget, the wall finally gave way. The enemy poured through the breach, and the officers of Babylon marched in and took their seats in the middle gate of the city as conquerors, and the thing Jeremiah had spent 40 years warning about, the thing everyone had called treason and defeatism and lies, arrived in a single afternoon exactly as he had said it would. The king ran. When Zedekiah saw the enemy inside his city, he and his soldiers waited for darkness and slipped out through a gate by the king's garden between the two walls and fled east toward the valley of the Jordan, trying to reach the wilderness and escape. They did not make it. The Babylonian troops chased them down and caught the king on the plains near Jericho, and his own soldiers scattered and abandoned him, and they took him in chains north to Nebuchadnezzar, who was waiting at his headquarters in Riblah. And there the conqueror did the cruelest thing in the entire book, a thing calculated to break a man completely before killing him. He brought out Zedekiah's sons, and he killed them, one after another, in front of their father, and he made the king watch every death. And then, the very instant the last of his children lay dead, before that image could fade or be replaced by any other, they put out Zedekiah's eyes. The murder of his own sons was the last thing he would ever see, seared into a mind that would now spend the rest of its days in total darkness with nothing else to look at. They bound him with chains of bronze and led him blind to Babylon, where he died in the dark. 2 old warnings that had seemed to contradict each other both came true in that one moment, that he would be carried to Babylon, and yet that he would never see it, and now the terrible sense of both was plain. He went to Babylon, and he went there blind. Then they burned it all. The temple that the people had chanted about as their unbreakable fortress, the palace of the kings, the great houses and the small houses, the whole city was put to the torch. And the walls that had held out for 18 months were pulled down into rubble. The bronze from the temple was broken up and hauled away. The people who survived the fire and the famine were rounded up and marched off to Babylon in a long chain of captives. And there was one last reversal, quiet and enormous. The commander of the guard left behind the very poorest of the people, the ones who owned nothing, the ones no empire bothers to deport, and he handed them the vineyards and the fields of the wealthy who had been carried away. The nobodies inherited the land, and Jeremiah himself was found among the prisoners at the staging point, bound in chains with everyone else, until the Babylonian commander, acting on Nebuchadnezzar's personal orders, picked him out, struck off his chains, and set him free, offering to take him to Babylon and care for him there, or to let him go wherever he wished. The enemy treated the prophet with more honor than his own nation ever had. And Jeremiah, given the choice of a comfortable exile, chose instead to stay in the ashes with the broken remnant of his people, because he had never been able to leave them, not once in his whole life. For a few short months, in the ruins, something green tried to grow. The Babylonians appointed a governor over the poor remnant left in the land, a good and gentleman named Gedaliah, the son of the same Ahikam who years before had put out his own hand to save Jeremiah from the mob. Gedaliah was wise and kind, and he gathered the frightened survivors and the scattered soldiers and told them the truth they needed to hear. Do not be afraid, settle down, farm the land, gather the wine and the fruit, serve Babylon quietly, and you will live. And it began to work. Jews who had fled to the neighboring countries heard there was a governor and a harvest, and they came home, and they brought in wine and summer fruit in abundance, and for one fragile season it looked as though a people might rebuild out of the wreckage. But there was a man of the old royal blood named Ishmael, put up to it by a foreign king who wanted the governorship for himself, and he came to kill Gedaliah. The good governor was warned. His own officers told him plainly that Ishmael was coming to murder him, and one of them quietly offered to strike first. And Gedaliah, whose decency was his one fatal weakness, refused to believe it. He could not imagine a man sharing his table and then betraying him, and he called the warning a lie. So Ishmael came with 10 men, and Gedaliah welcomed him, and they ate bread together, and in the middle of the meal Ishmael rose up and killed the governor and everyone with him. The next day, before word had spread, a group of pilgrims came down the road toward the ruined temple with offerings, mourning the destruction, and Ishmael lured them into the town and slaughtered most of them and threw the bodies into a pit. The one hope of a future in the land was murdered at a dinner table by a guest, and the fragile green shoot was cut down before it could root. Now the survivors were terrified, and their terror drove them straight into the last and most needless disaster of all. The governor Babylon had appointed was dead, along with Babylonian soldiers, and the remnant was sure that reprisal was coming, that the empire would return and destroy them for it. So they came to Jeremiah, all of them, from the least to the greatest, and they begged him to pray to God for direction, and they swore the most solemn oath imaginable that whatever answer came, good or bad, favorable or hard, they would obey it completely. And Jeremiah prayed, and for 10 days there was silence. And then the word came, and it was both clear and kind. Stay here in this land, God said. Do not be afraid of the king of Babylon. I am with you to save you and to rescue you from his hand. I will show you mercy, and I will build you up and not tear you down, and I will plant you and not uproot you. But do not go to Egypt. If you go down to Egypt to escape the war and the hunger, the very sword you are fleeing will catch you there, and the famine you dread will follow you there, and you will die in that land and never come home. It was a plain choice between life and death, and it was the answer to the exact question they had sworn to obey. And the instant they heard the one thing they did not want to hear, they called the prophet a liar. You are lying, the proud men told him to his face. God did not send you to say this. Someone has put you up to it, and they blamed his faithful scribe for turning him against them. Having sworn before God to obey whatever he said, they did the precise opposite of what he said, because they had never really wanted guidance at all. They had already decided to run to Egypt, and they had only wanted God to bless the decision they had made, and when he would not, they went anyway. They gathered the whole remnant, the men and the women and the little children and even the daughters of the dead king, and they marched down into Egypt, into the one country God had explicitly forbidden. And they took Jeremiah with them. They dragged the old prophet, who had begged them not to go, down into exile against his will, forcing the man who had spent his entire life warning them to share the fate he had warned them against. And in Egypt, safe as they imagined from the sword, they went right back to the old sin, burning incense to their foreign goddess of the stars. And when Jeremiah pleaded with them one final time, they told him flatly that they would keep doing it, and that things had gone better for them when they did. That is the last we truly see of him, an old man in a foreign land, still speaking, still unheeded, prophesying to people who had kidnapped him and would not listen to a word. We are not told how he died. The record simply lets him vanish into Egypt, with his message still on his lips, and there is a strange and fitting mystery in that silence, that the man who was known before he was born should slip out of the story without a grave, his last words falling on the same deaf ground as his first. But the book does not quite end on the deaf crowd. It turns aside near the very end to speak one small and private word to the one man who had stood by Jeremiah through all of it, the scribe Baruch, who had written down every syllable of doom for decades and received nothing but grief for his loyalty. Long before, worn out and heartbroken, Baruch had cried out that God had piled sorrow on his sorrow, that he was exhausted with sighing and could find no rest anywhere. Perhaps, like anyone, he had once hoped his life would amount to something grand, and instead it had amounted to taking dictation of a nation's ruin. And God's answer to him was not a promotion, and not a comfort of the ordinary kind. It was honest, and it was small, and it was infinitely tender. "Look," God said, "the whole world I built I am now tearing down. The entire land is being uprooted. This is not an age in which to seek great things for yourself, so do not seek them. But here is what I will give you, and it is not nothing, your life. Wherever you go, in all the wreckage and the fleeing and the fear, you will escape with your life, like a prize snatched out of a burning house." That was the gift. Not fame, not ease, not the restoration of everything lost, but simply his own life, handed to him as a treasure in a collapsing world. For a faithful man who had asked for nothing and been given only grief, it was exactly enough, and it is the kind of promise that only a God who truly notices the loyal and the overlooked would ever think to make. For 40 years the voice had been aimed at one small nation, one city, one stubborn people on a narrow strip of hills. And now, in the last movement of the book, the camera pulls all the way back, and the same voice that had thundered at Jerusalem turns outward and speaks over the whole known world, nation after nation. A great storm of judgment rolling across the map from Egypt in the south to Elam in the far east. The lesson underneath it is one the proud powers of the earth never learn until it is too late. The God of that little defeated country was never a local God of a local people. He was the God of all of them. And the sword that had fallen on his own house was about to fall on every house that thought itself safe. It began with Egypt, the oldest and grandest power of them all, and it began with a battle. At a river crossing far to the north called Carchemish, the army of Egypt had marched up in all its glory, rising like the flooding of the Nile, boasting that it would cover the earth. "Come up, you horses," the oracle cried. "Rage, you chariots. Let the mighty men march out in their armor." And the flood was thrown back. Babylon shattered the Egyptian army at that river, and the proud waters that meant to drown the world were sent reeling home in ruin. "Go up to Gilead and fetch your balm." The word mocked the wounded nation. Gather all your famous medicines, but it will do no good, for there is no cure for you. Egypt had trusted in its size and its age and its river, and none of it could heal the wound. And yet, right in the middle of the doom of Egypt, the voice broke off to do the tenderest thing, turning aside to whisper to the broken people of Israel, "Do not you be afraid, my servant, for I will make a complete end of all the nations I have scattered you among, but I will never make a complete end of you." Even in the roll call of the world's ruin, God could not go 3 sentences without reaching for his own bruised children. Then the coast. Against the Philistines, the old enemies by the sea, the word came as water again, but this time rising out of the north, an overflowing flood pouring down to swallow their cities whole, until the strong men would not even turn back for their own children in their terror. And in the middle of it came a question aimed at the blade of judgment itself, a question with real anguish in it. "O sword of the Lord, how long until you rest, until you go back into your sheath and are still?" Even the instrument of the doom seemed to grow weary of its work, and the prophet, who had felt every stroke of it, longed for the day it would finally lie quiet. Then Moab. And here the oracle turns strange and moving, because it judges a nation for the sin of comfort. Moab had never been conquered, never uprooted, never poured out. He was like wine left to sit undisturbed on its sediment for years, never emptied from one jar to another, so that his flavor stayed the same and his scent never changed. He was fat and settled and proud, at ease from his youth, and that long ease had made him arrogant, sure that nothing could ever touch him, and now the wine would finally be poured out and spilled. But watch what God does as he pronounces it, because it overturns everything we expect of a judge. He weeps. "I will howl for Moab," the voice says. "I will cry out for all of Moab. My heart shall moan for these people like a mournful flute." God grieves over the very nation he is bringing down, and even then, at the bottom of the sentence, he slips in a quiet promise that in days far off he will restore the fortunes of Moab. The judge is crying for the condemned and planning somewhere beyond the ruin to raise him up again. And then the storm sweeps on across the whole region, nation after nation, each one a portrait of a particular pride. Ammon, trusting in its idol and its treasures, is told its God cannot save it, and yet it too is promised a distant restoration. Edom, the ancient cousin of Israel, is dealt with hardest of all. The proud people who lived high in the clefts of the red rock and told themselves that no army could ever climb up to reach them. "Your own terror has fooled you," the word tells them. "The arrogance of your heart has deceived you. Though you build your nest as high as the eagle, I will bring you down." And for Edom there is no whispered mercy at the end, only desolation like the overthrow of the cities of the plain. Damascus, the great city of the north, melts with fear and feebleness. The wandering desert tribes of Arabia, secure in their tents and their camels, and the emptiness that guarded them, are told the emptiness will not save them either. And far away to the east, Elam, the nation of archers, is told that God will break its bow, the very source of its strength, and scatter it to the 4 winds of heaven, and yet even to distant Elam, a people Israel barely knew, comes the astonishing closing promise that in the latter days their fortunes too will be restored. It is worth stopping on that pattern, because it tells you something about the heart behind the whole terrible book. To nation after nation, even as he pronounced their ruin, God kept adding a far-off note of mercy, a promise of restoration reaching out past the doom to peoples who were not his own. His judgment was wide, but his mercy was wider, and it spilled over the edges of Israel and out onto the whole grieving world. And then, at the greatest length of all, the voice came for Babylon, the hammer of the whole earth, the golden empire that had swallowed everyone else. And the irony of it is the thundering climax of the entire book. Babylon had been the cup in God's hand, the cup of staggering wine that he made all the nations drink until they reeled and fell. Now Babylon herself was made to lift that same cup and drink it to the dregs. She had been the hammer that beat the nations flat. Now the word cried out in wonder, "How is the hammer of the whole earth cut in two and broken?" And notice, of all the exquisite justices in it, from which direction her destroyer would come. An enemy would rise up against Babylon out of the north, the very same direction from which Babylon herself had once poured down onto Judah, the very direction the young prophet had seen in his very first vision, a pot tilting from the north all those years before. The wheel had come the whole way around. The empire that thought itself eternal, that had burned the temple and blinded a king and dragged a nation off in chains, would fall suddenly in a single night, her proud idols shamed and toppled, her walls broken, because she had lifted herself up against the living God and imagined she would sit as a queen forever. And Jeremiah sealed it with one last sign, the perfect final act of a life full of acted-out sermons. He wrote all the doom of Babylon in a scroll and gave it to a man traveling there, and told him to read it aloud in the heart of the great city, and then to tie a stone to the scroll and throw it into the river Euphrates, and to say as it went under, "So shall Babylon sink and never rise again." The word of God, weighted with a stone, vanishing beneath the water of Babylon's own river, a picture of an empire going down into the dark to stay. And there the book of his own words comes to rest, with a single quiet line laid down like a stone on a grave. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. So what do we make of him, this man at the end of it all, and what did his long and painful life actually amount to? By every measure the world uses to keep score, Jeremiah was a failure. And it is important to say that plainly, because it is the key to everything. He preached for more than 40 years and changed almost no one's mind. He was called a traitor by his own people and a liar by the men who begged him for guidance. He was beaten, locked in stocks, thrown down a well to die in the mud, banned from the temple, watched his life's warnings ignored until his country burned to the ground, and was finally kidnapped and hauled off to a foreign land where he died without a single follower and without so much as a known grave. He converted no kings. He founded no movement. He saved no city. If you had asked anyone in Jerusalem to name the great men of the age, his name would have come somewhere near the bottom, if it came at all, the crank in the ox yoke, the weeper, the man who was always wrong about how bad things were until the day he turned out to be right about everything. Because that is the thing. He was right. The city fell exactly as he said it would, on the timetable he had named, for the reasons he had given, and the enemy that carried it off came from exactly the direction he had seen in a vision when he was still a frightened young man, protesting that he could not even speak. And being right was the least of what he left behind. This supposed failure, this man nobody listened to, poured out of his broken heart some of the most enduring words the human race has ever been given. It was Jeremiah who first spoke of a covenant written not on cold stone but inside the living human heart, a promise so central that an entire second half of the Bible would take its very name, the New Testament, from that single idea. It was Jeremiah who wrote, to a people who had lost absolutely everything, that God still knew the plans he had for them, plans for peace and not for harm, to give them a future and a hope, words now whispered at gravesides, and written in letters to the desperate 3,000 years later. He gave us the everlasting love that keeps drawing the runaway home, and the fountain of living water we keep trading for our own leaking wells, and the potter with his patient hands over the spinning clay, and the mother weeping at the roadside who is told to dry her eyes because her children are coming back. The tears that his neighbors mocked as weakness turned out to be his monument. He is remembered across all of history simply as the weeping prophet, and it is no insult. It is the highest honor the book could give him, because his tears were the truest thing about him. He loved a people who hated him. He grieved for a city that jeered at him. He wept for the very ones who threw him in the pit, and he never once stopped. And in that stubborn, unrewarded, heartbroken love, he came closer than almost anyone before him to showing what the heart of God actually looks like when it turns toward people who will not turn back. The empires that burned his words are dust. The kings who cut his scroll to pieces by the fire are gone without a trace. And the words of the weeping man they all ignored are still being read, still being wept over, and still keeping their long appointment with every heart that has ever felt known before it was born, and loved before it deserved it, and promised a morning it could not yet see.